In the bitter winter of 1815, beneath the grey skies of Northumberland, Frost Manor stood as cold and impenetrable as the Duke who ruled it. Alexander Greystone, the Duke of Ashford, had locked his heart away the day his parents died, leaving him to raise his younger sister alone. But Lady Evelyn's grief had become a prison of silence, and no physician could cure what ailed her soul. In desperation, the Duke did something unthinkable. He hired a companion of modest birth, a woman whose very presence would challenge everything he believed about duty, control, and the walls he'd built around his frozen heart. What he didn't know was that Miss Clara Langford's laughter would become the fire that threatened to burn down every defense he'd spent years constructing. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has traveled. Frost Manor loomed against the winter sky like a monument to sorrow itself. Its grey stone walls, covered in bare ivy vines, seemed to absorb what little light the December sun offered. Inside, the corridors echoed with emptiness, and the servants moved like ghosts, careful not to disturb the oppressive silence that had settled over the estate like a shroud. Alexander Greystone, the 5th Duke of Ashford, stood in his study, staring out at the frozen gardens below. At 30 years of age, he was considered one of the most eligible and most unapproachable men in England. His dark hair, always perfectly groomed, framed a face that might have been handsome if not for the perpetual severity of his expression. His grey eyes, the colour of winter storms, held no warmth, no invitation. He had been 25 when his parents perished in a carriage accident, leaving him guardian to his 15-year-old sister, Evelyn. 5 years had passed since that terrible day, and while Alexander had mastered the duties of his title with cold efficiency, Evelyn had never recovered. She had retreated into a world of silence, spending her days in her chambers, refusing visitors, barely eating. The sparkle that had once defined the vivacious girl had been extinguished, replaced by a hollow-eyed ghost who stared out windows at nothing. "Your Grace," his butler Morrison announced from the doorway, his voice carefully neutral. "Dr. Pemberton has arrived." Alexander turned from the window, his jaw tight. "Show him in." Dr. Pemberton entered, a portly man in his 60s with kind eyes that had seen too much suffering. He bowed respectfully. "Your Grace, I've examined Lady Evelyn as you requested." "And?" Alexander's voice was clipped, betraying none of the anxiety that coiled in his chest. "Physically, she remains weak from poor appetite, but there is no illness I can treat with medicine." The doctor hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Her affliction is of the spirit, Your Grace. She needs something beyond what I can prescribe. She needs companionship, someone young, warm, someone who might coax her back into the world of the living." Alexander's expression hardened. "I have hired 3 companions in the past 2 years. Evelyn refuses to speak to them. They accomplish nothing. Perhaps," Dr. Pemberton ventured carefully, "you have been hiring the wrong sort of companion. Ladies of quality, educated governesses. They approach Lady Evelyn with deference and propriety. What she needs is someone genuine, someone who can reach past her walls with authenticity rather than decorum. You're suggesting I hire someone common?" The distaste in Alexander's voice was evident. "I'm suggesting you hire someone real, Your Grace. Someone who has known grief themselves, someone who understands that healing doesn't follow the rules of society." The doctor met the Duke's cold stare without flinching. "There's a young woman in the village, Miss Clara Langford. She's the vicar's daughter, lost her own mother 3 years ago. She's been teaching the village children since then, and there's something about her, a lightness, a warmth that draws people to her. The children adore her." A vicar's daughter. Alexander's tone could have frozen water. "You want me to bring a village girl into my sister's chambers?" "I want you to save your sister's life," Dr. Pemberton replied quietly. "And Miss Langford may be the only person who can." After the doctor departed, Alexander remained in his study, staring into the fire. The suggestion offended every principle he held. His world was built on order, on the clear delineation between classes, on duty and propriety. To invite someone of such modest station into the intimate sphere of his household, to give them access to his vulnerable sister, it was unconscionable. Yet that night, as he passed Evelyn's chambers, he heard nothing. No movement, no sound of life. Just the terrible, suffocating silence that had become her only language. By morning, he had made his decision. 3 days later, Morrison announced another visitor. "Miss Clara Langford, Your Grace." Alexander looked up from his correspondence, his expression carefully controlled. "Show her in." The woman who entered was not what he had expected. Miss Langford was perhaps 23, of average height, with chestnut hair arranged in a simple but neat style. Her dress was modest, clearly well made, but several seasons old, the mark of genteel poverty. But it was her face that arrested his attention. Not because she was a great beauty, though her features were pleasing, but because of the open warmth in her brown eyes. The slight curve of her lips that suggested humor lurked perpetually nearby. She carried herself with quiet confidence, neither intimidated by her surroundings nor attempting to appear more than she was. She curtsied with practiced grace. "Your Grace, thank you for seeing me. Miss Langford." He did not invite her to sit, studying her with the same cool assessment he might give a horse he was considering purchasing. "Dr. Pemberton has recommended you as a companion for my sister. What qualifications do you possess for such a position?" If his coldness affected her, she didn't show it. "I have no formal qualifications, Your Grace, beyond my father's teaching and my own experience. But I've sat with the grieving. I've held the hands of those who couldn't find words for their pain. I've learned that healing doesn't require credentials. It requires presence. My sister has had 3 companions," Alexander said flatly. "All well-educated, all accomplished. They failed." "Perhaps," Clara said gently, "because they were trying to fix her rather than simply being with her." Something flickered in Alexander's grey eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or irritation. "And you believe you can succeed where they failed?" "I believe I can try, Your Grace, without expectations, without demands. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer someone in pain is simply companionship, not instruction, not improvement, just presence." Alexander was silent for a long moment. Everything in his being rebelled against this choice. She was too common, too unconventional, too warm. In his cold, ordered world, she would be like a flame introduced to frost, unpredictable, potentially destructive. And yet, Evelyn was dying by inches in her silence. "You will have 1 month, he said finally, his voice hard. "You will attend my sister daily, from 9 in the morning until 5 in the evening. You will take your meals in the servants' hall. You will not discuss family matters with anyone outside this house. You will address my sister as Lady Evelyn at all times, and you will remember your place. Is that understood?" Clara's chin lifted slightly, and for a moment he saw steel beneath the warmth. "Perfectly, Your Grace. Though I should tell you, if Lady Evelyn asks me to call her simply Evelyn, I will honor her wishes. Healing requires trust, and trust requires some equality, even between a lady and a vicar's daughter." Alexander's jaw tightened. No one contradicted him. No one challenged his directives. He should dismiss her immediately for such impertinence. Instead, he found himself saying, 1 month, Miss Langford. Do not waste it." As she left his study, Alexander returned to the window, watching her small figure cross the courtyard toward the servants' entrance. He felt a strange unease, as if he had just set something in motion that he could not control. In her tower chambers, Lady Evelyn Greystone sat in her window seat, staring at the frozen lake beyond the gardens, and felt nothing at all. Clara began her work the following Monday, arriving at Frost Manor as the winter sun cast long shadows across the frost-covered grounds. Morrison led her through corridors that seemed designed to intimidate. past portraits of stern-faced greystones, who stared down with the same cold disapproval she'd seen in the current Duke's eyes. Lady Evelyn's chambers were in the east wing, a suite of rooms that might have been beautiful if they weren't shrouded in shadows. The curtains were drawn against the weak daylight, and the air held the stale quality of a space where windows were never opened. Morrison knocked softly. "Lady Evelyn, Miss Langford has arrived." There was no response. The butler opened the door, revealing a sitting room furnished in faded elegance. Through an open doorway, Clara could see into a bedchamber where a young woman sat motionless in a window seat, wrapped in shawls, despite the fire burning in the hearth. "Lady Evelyn rarely speaks," Morrison whispered to Clara. "She takes no breakfast. Cook sends up a tray at noon and supper at 7, but she eats little. The previous companions tried reading to her, playing the pianoforte, teaching her needlework. Nothing worked. His Grace will check on your progress each evening." Clara nodded, and Morrison withdrew, closing the door with a soft click that sounded like a prison lock. For a long moment, Clara simply stood there, studying the girl by the window. Lady Evelyn was perhaps 20, with the same dark hair as her brother, though hers hung in a loose plait over one shoulder. She had the pale, translucent quality of someone who rarely saw sunlight, and her grey eyes, so like the Duke's, stared out at nothing with complete emptiness. Clara didn't approach immediately. Instead, she moved quietly to the other window and pulled back the curtains, letting winter light flood the room. "I know you didn't ask for me," Clara said conversationally, as if they were old friends catching up. "And I suspect you don't want me here. That's perfectly fine. I'm Clara Langford, and I'm rather persistent, which is either charming or annoying, depending on your perspective." Evelyn didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence in any way. Clara settled into a chair near the window, not too close, not invading Evelyn's space, but present. She pulled out a small bundle of knitting from her bag. "I'm making a scarf for Mrs. Pemberton," she said, her needles beginning to click softly. "She's been teaching me her pattern for cable stitching, though I keep getting it wrong. Look, I've had to unravel this section 3 times. Silence. Clara continued, her voice warm and unhurried. "I lost my mother 3 years ago. Fever. It was very sudden. She was well one day, and within a week she was gone. People kept telling me to be strong, to remember my duties, to honor her memory by carrying on, as if grief was something you could schedule, like darning socks or practicing scales on the pianoforte." Her needles continued their rhythmic clicking. Outside, a bird landed on the window ledge, and Clara smiled at it. "The worst part wasn't the crying or the anger," Clara continued softly. "It was the moments when I felt nothing at all, when the world seemed wrapped in grey wool, and I couldn't remember what it felt like to care about anything. People would speak to me, and their words would sound like they were coming from underwater. Does that sound familiar?" For the first time, Evelyn's eyes flickered, just slightly, just enough to suggest she had heard. Clara didn't push. She simply sat, knitting, occasionally commenting on her work or the view outside. When the noon tray arrived, she accepted it from the maid and set it on a small table between them. "I'm quite hungry," Clara said, helping herself to bread and cheese. "Would you mind if I ate? I find I think better with food." She paused. "Though cook has sent enough for 2, and it seems a shame to waste it." Evelyn didn't respond, but Clara noticed her eyes drift toward the tray just for a moment. The afternoon passed in this fashion. Clara present but not demanding, speaking occasionally but comfortable with silence, creating a space that asked nothing of the grieving girl beside her. As the clock struck 5, Clara stood and gathered her things. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said simply. "Same time. You don't have to speak to me, and you don't have to like me, but I'll be here." She curtsied and left, not seeing the way Evelyn's fingers had tightened slightly on the shawl around her shoulders. That evening, Alexander summoned Clara to his study. She arrived to find him standing by the fire, his posture rigid, his expression as severe as the day they'd met. "Report," he commanded, not inviting her to sit. "Lady Evelyn spent the day by the window," Clara said simply. She didn't speak, but she listened. She didn't eat from the tray, but she noticed it. "These are small things, Your Grace, but they're beginnings. In other words, you accomplished nothing." His voice was cold, dismissive. Clara met his eyes steadily. "I accomplished presence, Your Grace, which is more valuable than you might think. I hired you to help my sister, not to sit idly doing needlework." "Healing isn't idle work," Clara replied, her voice remaining calm despite the steel in his tone. "It's patient work. Your sister has been drowning in silence for 5 years. You cannot expect her to swim ashore in a single day simply because someone has finally thrown her a rope." Alexander's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You presume much, Miss Langford. I speak honestly, Your Grace, which is what you hired me to do, whether you realized it or not." Clara squared her shoulders. "If you want someone who will simply sit with your sister in silence and accomplish nothing, hire another proper lady companion. But if you want someone who might actually reach her, then you must allow me to do so in my own way, which requires patience from both of us." The Duke stared at her, and Clara could see the war raging behind those cold grey eyes. She had challenged him again, overstepped the boundaries of her station. She waited for the dismissal she was certain was coming. Instead, Alexander turned back to the fire. "1 month, he repeated, his voice tight. "Not a day more unless I see progress." "Understood, Your Grace." As Clara left his study, Alexander found himself unsettled in a way he couldn't name. The vicar's daughter had stood in his study and spoken to him as no one had in years, without fear, without deference, with only calm certainty. It was infuriating. It was also the first interesting thing that had happened at Frost Manor in 5 years. The days that followed established a pattern. Clara arrived each morning, opened the curtains despite Evelyn's lack of response, and settled into her quiet presence. She spoke occasionally about her father's sermons, about the village children she taught, about books she was reading, but she never demanded answers. She never pushed. On the 4th day, as Clara was describing a particularly disastrous attempt at baking bread that had resulted in something resembling a stone, she heard it, a sound, the faintest breath of something that might, with encouragement, have become a laugh. Clara looked up to find Evelyn's lips had curved ever so slightly, and the emptiness in her eyes had flickered with something that might have been amusement. "I know," Clara said, her heart soaring but her voice remaining casual. "I'm utterly hopeless in the kitchen. My father claims I could burn water, which isn't entirely fair. I've only done that twice." And there it was again. That faint whisper of sound, like the first bird of spring testing its voice after winter. That evening, when Alexander asked for her report, Clara simply said, "She smiled today, Your Grace. Just for a moment, but it was there." Alexander's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. "Continue," he said, and it sounded almost like approval. By the end of the 2nd week, Evelyn was eating small portions from her tray, while Clara ate beside her. She still hadn't spoken, but her eyes had lost some of their hollowness, and she sometimes turned her head to watch Clara's expressive hands as she described her day. On the 15th day, as Clara was telling a story about one of her young students mistaking the word disciple for pineapple during a Bible lesson, leading to a very confused reading about Jesus and his 12 pineapples, Evelyn laughed. It was soft, rusty from disuse, but it was unmistakably a laugh. Clara paused, her heart hammering, but she didn't make a grand moment of it. She simply smiled and continued her story, as if the sound of Evelyn's laughter was the most natural thing in the world. When Alexander heard the sound echoing faintly from his sister's chambers that afternoon, he stopped mid-stride in the corridor, his hand frozen on the door handle of his study. Laughter. His sister was laughing. He stood there, listening to that rusty, beautiful sound, and felt something crack in the fortress he'd built around his heart. Just the smallest fissure, but a crack nonetheless. When he saw Miss Langford leaving that evening, he called to her from the top of the stairs, "Miss Langford!" She turned, looking up at him with those warm brown eyes. "She laughed today," he said, and his voice was rough, uncertain. "Yes, Your Grace," Clara replied simply. She did. How did you— He stopped, unable to finish the question. Clara smiled, and it transformed her face into something luminous. I reminded her that the world still holds joy, Your Grace, even in the midst of sorrow. Sometimes we just need someone to show us where to look. As she left, Alexander remained on the stairs, staring after her, feeling the ice around his heart just beginning, to thaw. The transformation in Lady Evelyn, though gradual, was undeniable. By the third week, she had begun to speak, hesitant at first, just single words in response to Clara's gentle questions, then short sentences, and finally hesitant conversations that grew longer each day. Clara learned that Evelyn loved poetry, but hadn't read any since her parents' death. She learned that Evelyn had once dreamed of traveling to Italy to see the art galleries, but had abandoned all dreams when tragedy struck. She learned that Evelyn felt guilty for her grief, as if by mourning too long she was failing her brother, who had sacrificed everything to care for her. "He never smiles," Evelyn said one afternoon, her voice soft and sad. "I don't think I've seen him truly smile in 5 years. He's turned himself into stone for my sake, and I hate that I needed him to." "Perhaps," Clara said gently, "he needed to be stone to survive his own grief, not just for you, for himself as well. Duty can be a kind of armor, you know. It protects us when we're too wounded to face the world undefended." "Do you think he'll ever be warm again?" Evelyn asked, genuine worry in her eyes. Clara considered this. "I think warmth is like spring, Lady Evelyn. It doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in small moments, a patch of sunlight, a single flower, a day when the wind isn't quite so bitter. Perhaps your brother just needs reminding that winter doesn't last forever." "Witties." As Evelyn began to emerge from her darkness, Clara's days at Frost Manor expanded beyond the tower chambers. Evelyn wanted to walk in the gardens, so Clara accompanied her on short strolls along the frost-covered paths. Evelyn wanted to try watercolours again, so Clara sat with her in the morning room, attempting to paint alongside her, despite having no artistic talent whatsoever. "That's supposed to be a rose?" Evelyn said one morning, staring at Clara's canvas with barely suppressed amusement. "It's an abstract interpretation of a rose," Clara replied with dignity. "Very modern, very avant-garde. It looks like a red blob ate a green stick and is having regrets." Clara gasped in mock offence, but her eyes danced with delight. "You wound me, my lady. I'll have you know this is my masterpiece." Evelyn laughed, a real, full laugh, and the sound echoed through the morning room like bells. Neither of them noticed Alexander standing in the doorway, watching them. He had come to check on his sister's progress, as had become his habit, but he found himself arrested by the scene before him. Evelyn, actually painting, her face animated in a way he hadn't seen in 5 years, and Miss Langford, covered in paint smudges, making ridiculous claims about her terrible artwork with such cheerful conviction that even he felt his lips twitch. When Clara finally noticed him, she stood quickly, her expression shifting to proper deference. "Your Grace, forgive me, I didn't hear you arrive." But Evelyn's smile didn't fade. "Alexander, come look at Miss Langford's painting. She claims it's a rose, but I think it's actually a mysterious creature from the deep." Something flickered across Alexander's face, surprise perhaps at hearing his sister speak to him with such lightness. He stepped into the room, his gaze moving to Clara's canvas. "That is—" He paused, and Clara braced herself for cutting commentary. "Certainly abstract." "You see," Clara said to Evelyn, "His Grace recognizes artistic innovation when he sees it." "I said it was abstract," Alexander replied dryly. "I did not say it was good." Evelyn giggled, and Clara's eyes widened with delighted shock at the Duke's unexpected humour. Alexander's gaze met Clara's, and for just a moment something passed between them. An acknowledgement, a shared pleasure in Evelyn's happiness, a connection that neither had expected. Then his expression shuttered again, the familiar coldness descending. "Continue your lesson. I merely came to see that you were both well." But as he left, Clara could have sworn she saw the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. As January gave way to February, Alexander found himself increasingly aware of Miss Langford's presence in his home. He would hear her laughter echoing from the morning room, or catch glimpses of her walking with Evelyn in the gardens, animated in conversation. The servants spoke of her with warmth. She remembered their names, asked after their families, never stood on ceremony in the servants' hall. She was, in every way, inappropriate for his household, and yet she had accomplished what no one else could. Evelyn was alive again, truly alive, not merely existing. She ate properly now, spoke freely, even made plans for the future. Dr. Pemberton declared it a miracle. Alexander knew it wasn't a miracle. It was Clara Langford. One evening, as he stood in his study reviewing estate documents, he heard voices in the hall. Evelyn and Clara saying goodbye for the day. "Will you come to tea tomorrow instead of lessons?" Evelyn was asking. "As a friend, not a companion." "I would be honored," Clara replied warmly, "though I should warn you my tea manners are suspect. I tend to gesture too much and nearly spill things." "Good. Alexander's tea parties are always dreadfully proper. We could use some chaos." Clara laughed, and the sound seemed to warm the very stones of Frost Manor. After she left, Alexander found himself standing at his study window, watching her small figure disappear down the drive toward the village. The month he had given her was nearly over. By rights, he should dismiss her now. Evelyn was clearly improved, and a vicar's daughter had no place in their daily lives beyond her role as paid companion. Yet the thought of Frost Manor without Clara's warmth, without her laughter echoing through the corridors, filled him with an emotion he couldn't name. He had spent 5 years building walls of ice around his heart, convincing himself that duty and coldness were armor against pain. But Clara had walked into his fortress with her gentle presence and her ridiculous paintings and her genuine care for his sister, and the walls were melting. It terrified him. The next afternoon, as promised, Clara joined them for tea in the drawing room. Morrison served with his usual precision, though Alexander noticed the butler's eyes held uncharacteristic warmth when he looked at Miss Langford. "Miss Langford," Alexander said, his tone formal, "my sister tells me you've been teaching the village children." "Yes, Your Grace, reading, arithmetic, scripture, simple lessons but important ones." "And do you enjoy this work?" Clara's face lit up. "Very much. There's something wonderful about watching a child's face when a lesson suddenly makes sense. When letters become words, when numbers reveal patterns, it's like watching doors open in their minds." "You speak of it with passion," Alexander observed, studying her over his teacup. "Because I feel passionate about it," Clara said simply. "Every child deserves education, regardless of their station. Knowledge is freedom, Your Grace." Evelyn glanced between them, sensing an undercurrent she couldn't quite identify. "A radical notion," Alexander said, his voice carefully neutral. "Perhaps," Clara replied, meeting his gaze steadily, "but no less true for being radical." Something sparked in Alexander's grey eyes, challenge, interest, something he hadn't felt in years. Later that evening, after Clara had departed and Evelyn had retired, Alexander stood in his study, staring into the fire. He was feeling things he had thought dead, curiosity, interest, something else he refused to name. Miss Clara Langford, with her modest dress and her warm eyes and her radical notions about education, had become far more dangerous to his carefully ordered world than he had ever imagined. But what truly terrified him was how much he looked forward to seeing her each day, how his cold, empty manor had begun to feel like a home again, and how the ice around his heart was melting faster than he could rebuild it. Winter was ending, even in the frozen halls of Frost Manor, and Alexander Greystone was beginning to realize that spring, when it finally arrived, might change everything. By mid-February, the impossible had happened. Lady Evelyn Greystone had returned to society. It began with a small dinner party at Frost Manor, just the vicar and his daughter, Dr. Pemberton and his wife, and 1 or 2 neighbouring families. Alexander had agreed to it reluctantly, Worried that it was too soon, that Evelyn would falter under the scrutiny, he needn't have worried. With Clara at her side, Evelyn blossomed. She spoke about art and poetry, expressed opinions about books she'd been reading, even laughed at Mr. Pemberton's terrible jokes. The guests departed with genuine warmth, commenting on Lady Evelyn's remarkable recovery. But as the evening ended and the last guests departed, a new carriage arrived, bearing an unexpected visitor, Lady Charlotte Ashworth, a distant cousin, and one of London's most celebrated beauties. She swept into the drawing-room in a gown that cost more than Clara earned in a year, her blonde hair perfectly arranged, her blue eyes calculating. "Cousin Alexander," she exclaimed, offering her hand for him to kiss. "And dear Evelyn, how wonderful to see you looking so well." Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lady Charlotte, this is unexpected. I was visiting the Claremonts nearby and heard the most remarkable rumours about Evelyn's recovery. I simply had to see for myself." Charlotte's gaze swept the room, landing on Clara with thinly veiled curiosity. "And who is this?" "Miss Clara Langford," Alexander said, his voice carefully controlled. "My sister's companion." Something flickered in Charlotte's eyes. Dismissal, calculation. "How charming. A village girl, I presume? How progressive of you, Alexander." Clara felt the slight like a slap, but she curtsied gracefully. "I serve Lady Evelyn in whatever capacity brings her comfort, Lady Charlotte." "Of course you do," Charlotte said, her smile sharp. "How devoted." The tension in the room was palpable. Evelyn's hand found Clara's, squeezing it in silent support. "Lady Charlotte," Alexander said, his voice cold with warning, "Miss Langford has been instrumental in my sister's recovery. She is to be treated with respect in this house." Charlotte's eyebrows rose. "My dear Alexander, I meant no offence. I merely find it fascinating that you've allowed someone of such modest station, such intimate access to your family." "Perhaps," Clara said quietly, her voice steady despite the rising colour in her cheeks. "That is because healing requires humanity, not pedigree. Lady Evelyn needed a friend, not another reminder of society's expectations." Charlotte's smile turned glacial. "How very democratic of you." "That's enough," Alexander said, his voice like ice. "Charlotte, you've had a long journey. Morrison will show you to your chambers. We can continue this conversation when you're rested." As Charlotte was led away, she glanced back at Clara with a look that promised future trouble. Once they were alone, Evelyn turned to Clara, her face anxious. "I'm so sorry. Charlotte has always been horrid, but I never thought—" "It's quite all right," Clara said gently, though her hands trembled slightly. "I knew when I accepted this position that there would be those who disapproved." "My sister is correct," Alexander said, and both women looked at him in surprise. His grey eyes were fixed on Clara, intense in a way she'd never seen. "Lady Charlotte's behaviour was unconscionable. You have earned your place here through dedication and genuine care. Your station is irrelevant." Clara's breath caught at the intensity in his gaze, at the unexpected defence from the man who had been so cold to her just weeks ago. "Thank you, Your Grace," she whispered. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, an acknowledgement of something growing that neither dared name. The following days were complicated by Charlotte's presence. She inserted herself into every activity, monopolizing Alexander's time with discussions of London society, mutual acquaintances, and thinly veiled hints about her own eligibility. She treated Clara with calculated courtesy that barely masked contempt, and made certain that Clara was reminded constantly of her inferior status. During one afternoon tea, Charlotte turned to Clara with a patronizing smile. "Miss Langford, you must find our conversations about London terribly dull. I imagine village life offers such simple pleasures." "I find contentment in meaningful work," Clara replied evenly, "which I suspect is something anyone can understand, regardless of whether they reside in a village or a city." "How quaint," Charlotte said. "Alexander, do you remember the Worthington Ball last season? When Lord Hartley proposed to Lady Anne right there in the middle of the waltz, it was the event of the season. Alexander's expression was unreadable. I remember it was considered rather gauche, actually. Charlotte laughed, a calculated sound. You always were so particular about propriety. It's one of your most admirable qualities. You always know exactly where everyone belongs. The barb was aimed at Clara, and it hit its mark. Clara excused herself shortly after, claiming she needed to prepare lessons for the village children the next day. Evelyn found her in the morning room a few minutes later, staring out at the gardens with unusual stillness. "Please don't let Charlotte drive you away," Evelyn said urgently. "She's dreadful, but she'll be gone soon." "It's not about Lady Charlotte," Clara said softly. "It's about reality. She's right, you know. I don't belong in this world. I've been playing at being something I'm not." "You belong wherever you're valued," Evelyn said fiercely. "And you're valued here, by me and by Alexander, whether he's admitted it to himself yet or not." Clara's cheeks flushed. "Lady Evelyn, that's inappropriate." "Is it? I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one notices. I've heard how his voice softens when he speaks your name. My brother has been frozen for 5 years, Clara, and you've brought him back to life just as surely as you brought me back." "Your brother is a duke," Clara said, her voice breaking slightly. "And I am a vicar's daughter with no fortune, no connections, no place in his world." "Then perhaps his world needs to change," Evelyn said simply. That evening, Charlotte cornered Alexander in his study, closing the door behind her with deliberate intimacy. "Alexander, we must speak plainly," she said, settling into a chair without invitation. "This situation with Miss Langford has become inappropriate. I fail to see how my sister's companion is any of your concern," Alexander replied coldly. "Don't be obtuse. The entire household can see what's happening. You're developing feelings for her, or worse, have already developed them. A duke and a village girl. It's a scandal waiting to happen." "There is no scandal," Alexander said, his voice dangerous. "Not yet. But if you continue on this path, there will be. You have a duty to your name, Alexander, to your family's legacy. What would a marriage to Miss Langford bring you? No connections, no fortune, no benefit to your estate or standing." "I don't recall discussing marriage," Alexander said icily, though his heart was pounding. "You don't have to. It's written all over your face, every time you look at her." Charlotte stood, moving closer. "I'm offering you an alternative, my family's connections, my understanding of your world, a partnership between equals. Marry me, Alexander. It's the sensible choice." Alexander looked at Charlotte, beautiful, connected, perfectly suited to be a duchess by every measure society valued. The cold, dutiful part of him that had ruled for 5 years recognized the logic in her words. But when he closed his eyes, he didn't see Charlotte. He saw warm brown eyes and gentle hands painting terrible pictures. He heard laughter echoing through frozen corridors. He felt the crack in the ice around his heart widening into a chasm. "I appreciate your offer," Alexander said carefully, "but I must decline. You're correct that duty has always guided my choices. But I'm beginning to understand that duty without heart is merely a different kind of death." Charlotte's eyes flashed with fury. "You're making a mistake, Alexander. Miss Langford may have enchanted you with her simple charm, but she'll never be accepted. You'll ruin yourself for a woman who can bring you nothing." "She brought my sister back to life," Alexander said quietly, "and she's brought me back to life as well. That's worth more than all the connections in London." "Then you're a fool," Charlotte spat, sweeping toward the door. "And fools deserve what they get. Don't come crying to me when society tears you both apart." After she stormed out, Alexander stood alone in his study, his heart racing with a realization he could no longer deny. He was in love with Clara Langford. The revelation terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. For 5 years he had been frozen, convinced that emotion was weakness, that duty was all that mattered. But Clara had shown him that warmth was not weakness, it was courage. That laughter in the face of sorrow was not frivolity, it was survival. The question was, what was he willing to risk for it? The next morning, Charlotte departed in a fury, making vague threats about speaking to mutual acquaintances about the unsuitable situation at Frost Manor. Alexander watched her carriage disappear with relief. That afternoon, he found Clara in the library with Evelyn, both of them surrounded by books. Clara was reading aloud from Shakespeare's sonnets, her voice bringing the words to life, while Evelyn listened with rapt attention. When she finished the poem, both women looked up to find him standing in the doorway. "That was beautiful," Evelyn said softly. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? You're far lovelier," Alexander found himself saying, then stopped, realizing his words were directed not at his sister, but at Clara. Clara's cheeks flushed, and she stood quickly. "Your Grace, I should—" "Stay," Alexander said, the word coming out rougher than he intended. "Please, I would like to speak with you both." He stepped into the library, and for the first time in 5 years, allowed himself to be vulnerable. "I owe you both an apology," he said quietly. "Evelyn, I spent 5 years trying to protect you by freezing my own heart, thinking that coldness would make me strong enough to bear anything. I was wrong. I became stone, and in doing so, I trapped us both in winter." "Alexander," Evelyn began, but he held up a hand. "And Miss Langford, Clara," the use of her first name made her breath catch. "You came into our frozen world with warmth and laughter, and refused to let the cold extinguish your light. You saved my sister, but more than that, you reminded me that life without warmth is not life at all. It's merely existence." "Your Grace," Clara whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "I don't know what the future holds," Alexander continued, taking a step closer to her. "I don't know how to navigate these feelings while honoring my duties, but I do know one thing. I refuse to return to winter. Not now. Not after experiencing spring." Evelyn smiled through her own tears. "It's about time, brother." Clara looked between them, her heart soaring, even as her practical mind warned her of the impossibilities ahead. A duke and a vicar's daughter, it was the stuff of fairy tales, not reality. But as Alexander's grey eyes met hers, warm for the first time since she'd known him, she allowed herself to hope. Spring had come to Frost Manor at last. The weeks that followed were among the strangest of Clara's life. Alexander's admission had changed everything and nothing. He still maintained propriety in public, still addressed her formally in front of the servants, still held himself with ducal dignity. But in private moments, when they found themselves alone in the library, or walking the gardens with Evelyn, or sitting in the drawing room while his sister played the pianoforte, his walls continued to crumble. He asked about her childhood, her dreams, her thoughts on everything from poetry to politics. He shared stories of his own youth before duty had hardened him. He smiled, truly smiled, and the transformation was breathtaking. The cold, severe Duke of Ashford was becoming someone else, a man with depth and humour and a capacity for warmth that surprised even him. But the spectre of society's judgment loomed over them. Charlotte's departure had been strategic, not defeated. Within a fortnight, whispers began to reach Frost Manor. The vicar's daughter had overstepped. The Duke was besotted. The scandal was brewing. One morning, Clara arrived to find Alexander in his study, a letter clenched in his hand, his expression thunderous. "What's happened?" she asked, forgetting propriety in her concern. He looked up, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Fear. "My aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Ashford, is arriving tomorrow. Someone has informed her of our situation." He said the last word carefully, as if testing its weight. Clara's heart sank. The Dowager Duchess was legendary, a formidable woman who had ruled London society for decades, who valued propriety above all else. "She'll demand you dismiss me," Clara said quietly. "She'll demand many things," Alexander replied, his jaw tight. "That doesn't mean I'll comply." "Your Grace!" "Alexander!" Clara stopped, struggling with emotions she had no right to feel. Perhaps she's right. Perhaps this has gone too far. Your position, your family's reputation. "Do you want to leave?" Alexander asked, standing and moving around the desk toward her. Tell me honestly, Clara. Do you want to go? What I want is irrelevant, Clara whispered. You're a duke. You're the woman I love, Alexander said, the words finally spoken aloud after weeks of dancing around them. Your station, your lack of fortune, your village upbringing, none of it matters to me. You are brave and kind and genuine in a world full of artifice. You brought light back into my darkness. How could any of society's rules matter more than that? Clara's tears spilled over. Because those rules are real, Alexander. Because a duke who marries beneath his station loses influence, loses respect. Because your children would be looked down upon, your family's name diminished. I cannot be the cause of your ruin. And I cannot return to the frozen existence I had before you, Alexander said fiercely, taking her hands in his. These past weeks, I felt alive for the first time in 5 years. You've taught me that warmth is not weakness, that laughter is not frivolity, that love, his voice broke, love is worth more than all the cold duty in the world. But your aunt... Let me worry about my aunt, Alexander said. Tomorrow she'll arrive with all her expectations and demands. But tonight, I need you to answer one question honestly. Do you love me? Clara looked into his grey eyes, no longer cold, but blazing with emotion, and felt her careful resolutions crumble. Yes, she whispered. God help me. Yes, I love you. Alexander's kiss was gentle but desperate, a man emerging from winter into the warmth of spring, tentative but hungry for the heat. When they finally parted, both were trembling. Then we'll face whatever comes together, he said. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford arrived the next afternoon in a magnificent carriage, accompanied by a lady's maid and enough luggage to suggest an extended stay. She was 70 if she was a day, but her spine was ramrod straight, her eyes sharp as daggers, and her presence filled Frost Manor with imperious authority. Alexander greeted her in the drawing room with Evelyn at his side. Clara had been dismissed to the servants' hall, a tactical decision to avoid immediate confrontation. "Grandmother," Evelyn said, curtsying with genuine affection despite her nervousness. "Evelyn, child, you look well," the dowager said, studying her granddaughter with approval. "I heard reports of your recovery. They appear accurate." "Thanks to Miss Langford," Evelyn said bravely. "Ah, yes, the vicar's daughter." The dowager turned her piercing gaze on Alexander. "Shall we stop pretending this is a social call? I've come because I've heard disturbing reports that you've developed an inappropriate attachment to your sister's paid companion." "The reports are accurate," Alexander said calmly. "I love her, and I intend to marry her." The dowager's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "You intend to marry a woman with no fortune, no connections, no training in managing a duchy. Have you lost your senses?" "I've found them, actually," Alexander replied. "For 5 years, I've been exactly what you taught me to be. Cold, dutiful, proper. I've honored every expectation, followed every rule, and I've been miserable. Miss Langford has shown me that there's more to life than duty. Love is a luxury, Alexander. Duty is what sustains families like ours. Duty without heart is death," Alexander said quietly. "I've lived that death. I won't return to it." The dowager was silent for a long moment, studying her grandson with those sharp eyes. "This will cause a scandal. I know. Society will judge you harshly. I know. Some doors will close to you, to your children. I know," Alexander said, his voice steady. "And I've weighed all of it against the prospect of a lifetime with Clara. Society's doors don't matter. Love does." The dowager turned to Evelyn. "And you, child, what do you think of this madness?" "I think," Evelyn said carefully, "that Clara saved my life. I think she brought my brother back from his frozen prison. I think love matters more than pedigree. And I think if Alexander doesn't marry her, he's a fool." The corner of the dowager's mouth twitched, just slightly. "I see she's made you bold as well." She sighed, a sound of resignation. "Very well. I wish to meet this paragon who's turned my grandson into a romantic fool." Clara was summoned with trembling hands. She entered the drawing room to find the dowager seated like a queen on her throne, examining her with eyes that missed nothing. "Miss Langford, sit." Clara sat, her back straight, her hands folded, meeting the dowager's gaze with as much courage as she could muster. "My grandson tells me he loves you," the dowager said flatly. "What do you have to say to that?" "I say he deserves better than me," Clara replied honestly. "Someone who can navigate society, manage a grand estate, bring connections and fortune to his family. I can offer him none of those things. And yet I love him," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I love his kindness beneath the coldness, his dry humor, the way he loves his sister so fiercely. I love the man he's becoming as he allows himself to thaw. But I also know that love alone cannot overcome the obstacles we face." The dowager studied her for a long, excruciating moment. Then, surprisingly, she smiled, just slightly. "You have courage, at least. That's something." She turned to Alexander. "If you marry her, it will be difficult. There will be whispers, snubs, closed doors. Some of your peers will never accept her." "I know," Alexander said, moving to stand beside Clara's chair, his hand finding hers. "You'll need to be strong. Both of you, united against the judgment." "We will be," Alexander said firmly. The dowager sighed again, but this time it sounded almost amused. "When I was young, I was in love with my father's secretary. He had no fortune, no title, nothing society valued. My parents forbade the match and married me to the Duke instead. I did my duty, bore him heirs, managed his estates brilliantly, and I was never happy. Not once in 50 years of marriage." She looked at Clara with something that might have been envy. "Don't let duty steal your joy, Miss Langford. Life is shorter than you think, and regret lasts forever." Clara's eyes widened with surprise. "Your Grace, are you saying—" "I'm saying," the dowager interrupted, "that if my foolish grandson is determined to marry you, I'll not stand in his way. But," her voice turned stern, "you will need training. You'll learn estate management, social etiquette, the art of navigating society. You'll work harder than you've ever worked in your life." "I will," Clara promised, tears streaming down her face. "And you," the dowager turned to Alexander, "will support her through the difficult times ahead. The first year will be the worst. Some will cut you. There will be gossip. You must be her shield." "I will be," Alexander vowed. Evelyn laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Does this mean—" "It means," the dowager said, standing with regal dignity, "that Frost Manor is about to host a wedding that will scandalize half of London and delight the other half. The Greystones have always been unconventional after all. Why stop now?" As the dowager swept from the room to rest before dinner, Alexander pulled Clara to her feet, his eyes blazing with love and relief. "We're going to be married," he said, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "We're going to be married," Clara echoed, laughing through her tears. Evelyn threw her arms around them both. "Finally! I thought you'd both dance around each other forever." That evening, Alexander proposed formally in the library, with Evelyn as their witness. He had no ring prepared, so he offered Clara his mother's ring, an emerald that had sat in a drawer for 5 years because he'd never imagined having a reason to offer it to anyone. "Clara Langford," he said, kneeling before her with the ring in his hand, "you walked into my frozen world and brought spring. You taught me to laugh again, to feel again, to hope again. Will you marry me? Will you be my duchess, my partner, my love?" "Yes," Clara whispered. 1,000 times, yes. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Later that night, as Clara prepared to leave Frost Manor for the last time, as merely a companion, Alexander walked her to the door. "The next time you enter this house," he said softly, "it will be as its mistress, as my wife." "I'm still terrified," Clara admitted, "of failing you, of not being enough." "You are more than enough," Alexander said, cupping her face in his hands. "You are everything, and together we'll face whatever comes." As Clara walked home through the February twilight, the emerald ring heavy on her finger, she felt the weight of what lay ahead. But she also felt joy, pure, undiluted joy, because love had triumphed over duty, warmth had melted ice, and spring had come at last to Frost Manor. The wedding took place in early April as spring finally arrived in Northumberland. Alexander wanted a grand affair in London to make a statement about his pride in his choice, but Clara convinced him otherwise. "Let's marry in the village church," she said, "where my father can perform the ceremony, where the people who've known me all my life can witness our vows. Let's begin our marriage with authenticity, not with society's approval." Alexander agreed, though the dowager insisted on certain concessions, a wedding breakfast at Frost Manor for the local gentry, and a small notice in the London papers that would make their union official in society's eyes. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the first truly warm day after a bitter winter. The small stone church was filled with an unusual mix of people. Villagers who'd known Clara since childhood, local gentry who'd known the Greystones for generations, and a small delegation from London, including the dowager and a few of Alexander's closest friends who'd proven themselves true, despite the scandal. Clara wore a simple white gown that had belonged to her mother, altered to fit her by the village seamstress. She carried wild flowers from the fields around Frost Manor. She had no attendants beyond Evelyn, who stood beside her dressed in pale blue, her face radiant with happiness. When Clara entered the church on her father's arm, she looked up to see Alexander waiting at the altar. He was dressed impeccably, as always, but what arrested her was his expression. Gone was the cold Duke who'd first interviewed her in his study. In his place was a man transformed, eyes warm with love, face soft with emotion, every wall demolished. Her father performed the ceremony with genuine joy, his voice thick with emotion as he pronounced them man and wife. When Alexander kissed her, the small church erupted in applause, and Clara felt tears of happiness streaming down her face. The wedding breakfast at Frost Manor was surprisingly warm, despite the mix of classes and stations. The dowager presided with gracious authority, making it clear through her approval that anyone who dared snub the new Duchess of Ashford would face her displeasure. The villagers mingled with the gentry, united in their affection for Clara and their curiosity about the love story that had transformed the cold Duke. Dr. Pemberton raised a toast. "To the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, may their marriage be blessed with as much warmth as their courtship brought to Frost Manor." As spring turned to summer, Clara began her education in earnest. The dowager stayed at Frost Manor for 3 months, teaching Clara everything from estate management to the intricate dance of London society. It was exhausting work, but Clara approached it with the same determination she'd brought to reaching Evelyn. "You'll never be like them," the dowager said one afternoon as they reviewed account books. "The other duchesses with their perfect pedigrees and generations of training. But you don't need to be. You have something they lack, genuineness. Use it. Let them see that a duchess can also be real." Alexander supported her through every challenge. When she made mistakes at dinner parties, he deflected attention with dry humor. When she struggled with the complexity of managing servants, he worked alongside her to learn systems that had been in place for generations. When whispers reached them from London about the unsuitable duchess, he held her close and reminded her that their opinion mattered less than their happiness. By autumn, Clara had begun to find her footing. She started a school on the estate for the children of tenants and servants, teaching them reading and arithmetic herself. The local gentry, who had been skeptical at first, began to see that the new duchess brought genuine benefits to the community. Her warmth and accessibility made Frost Manor a place of hospitality rather than cold grandeur. One October afternoon, Clara found Alexander in the library reviewing estate correspondence. She settled into the chair beside him, and he automatically reached for her hand, his attention still on his papers. A gesture so natural, it spoke of deep comfort. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Choosing me over someone suitable?" Alexander looked up, his grey eyes warm. "Not even for a moment. Do you know what I was thinking about just now? Estate business? I was thinking how 5 years ago I sat in this very chair, convinced I would live my entire life in frozen duty. I had accepted that happiness wasn't for people like me. And then you walked through that door with your terrible paintings and your gentle insistence that laughter matters, and you demolished every wall I'd built. Your walls needed demolishing, Clara said, smiling. They were very dreary. Alexander laughed, a sound that still delighted her every time she heard it. They were. And now look at us. Evelyn is thriving, planning a trip to Italy next spring. The estate is flourishing under your innovations, and He paused, bringing her hand to his lips. I am happier than I ever imagined possible. Even with society's whispers. Society will always whisper. But let them. We know the truth, that love matters more than lineage, that warmth is stronger than propriety, that a vicar's daughter can be the finest duchess England has ever seen. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. I love you so much it frightens me sometimes. Good, Alexander said, pulling her onto his lap despite the impropriety. Fear means it matters, and this, he gestured between them, matters more than anything. That evening they walked the gardens together, as they often did, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. The frost that had given the manor its name had long since melted, and now the gardens bloomed with late-season roses. They passed the bench where Evelyn used to sit in silent grief, and Clara squeezed Alexander's hand. Do you remember the first day I came here, when you told me I had 1 month to show progress or be dismissed? I remember thinking you were completely unsuitable and probably useless, Alexander admitted with a rueful smile. And now? Now I think you were exactly what we needed. What I needed. You were spring breaking through winter, Clara. You were life returning after death. They stopped at their favorite spot overlooking the lake, now reflecting the sunset in shimmering gold. Alexander wrapped his arms around her from behind, and Clara leaned back against him, feeling utterly safe. Thank you, he whispered against her hair. For what? For seeing the man beneath the ice, for having the courage to melt the walls, for loving me when I was so determined to be unlovable. You were never unlovable, Clara said softly. You were just frozen, and ice always melts when spring arrives. In the years that followed, the Duke and Duchess of Ashford became legendary in their own way, not for scandal, though whispers never quite faded, but for the genuine warmth of their hospitality and the obvious depth of their love. Their home became a place where station mattered less than character, where laughter echoed through previously frozen corridors, where genuine connection flourished. They had 4 children, each taught that love mattered more than title, that kindness was stronger than pride, that warmth was the greatest legacy they could inherit. Lady Evelyn travelled to Italy, met an artist in Florence, and scandalized society further by marrying for love rather than status. The Greystones, it seemed, had started a family tradition. The village school Clara founded became a model that other estates copied. Education began to spread through the countryside, breaking down barriers that had stood for centuries. And on winter evenings, when snow covered the grounds and frost painted the windows, the Duke and Duchess of Ashford would sit by the fire in the library, hands intertwined, and remember the bitter February when a vicar's daughter had walked through the door and brought spring to Frost Manor. Do you know what I love most about our story? Clara asked one such evening, her head on Alexander's shoulder. What? That it's real, not perfect, not without struggle, but real. We didn't have a fairy tale. We had something better. We had choice. Alexander kissed her forehead, his heart full. You chose to see the best in a frozen duke. I chose to let you thaw me. And together we chose love over everything society said should matter. That's the most powerful magic there is. Outside, snow fell softly over Frost Manor, but inside warmth reigned. The ice had melted completely, replaced by the enduring heat of love chosen freely, fought for bravely, and cherished deeply. Spring had come to Frost Manor, and it had never left. The end of coldness, the beginning of warmth, the triumph of a love that refused to follow anyone's rules except its own. And in the morning room, where Clara had once painted terrible roses, while Evelyn laughed, their children now played, filling the once silent manor with the sound of joy, the greatest legacy the Duke and Duchess of Ashford could have given them. Love, after all, is the only thing that truly melts ice. And when it's genuine, when it's brave, when it's willing to defy the world for the sake of warmth, it lasts forever. Before you go, I want to ask you a favor. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to tell me in the comments, what's your favorite part of this story? I read every single comment, and your words mean the world to me. Thank you for being part of this journey.